This year, we're pleased to continue the tradition of distinguished speakers addressing the issues central to the condition of democracy. And it's therefore my great pleasure and honor to introduce this year's lecturer. Anne Applebaum is an historian who won a Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction for her book Gulag, a work that recreates what life was like in Soviet concentration camps and connects them to the larger history of the Soviet Union. Anne is astonishingly prolific. She's authored other books that have made a defining imprint on the public debate. These include Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, published in 2017, which received the Lionel Gelber Prize, as well as the Duff Cooper Prize, and Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, which lays out the imposition of Soviet totalitarianism in Central Europe after World War II. Iron Curtain won the 2012 Kundal Prize for Historical Literature and the Duke of Westminster Medal. Over the years, Anne's lucid and captivating writing has also appeared in an immense number of leading publications, from Foreign Affairs, the New York Review of Books, and the Journal of Democracy, and so many others too long to list here. Anne's a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine and was a Washington Post columnist for 15 years and a former member of the Post editorial board. Simply put, Anne Applebaum is among our era's most influential public intellectuals. Finally, Anne possesses a deep curiosity about how things work. We see that at the NED on a routine basis. In addition to her remarkable scholarship as an historian, she's also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she's undertaking cutting-edge work on modern forms of disinformation and 21st century propaganda, working to address some of democracy's defining contemporary challenges. And she's uniquely qualified to share insights on the topic this evening relating to the growing authoritarian challenge. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Anne Applebaum to deliver the 2022 Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture on Democracy in the World.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Damon and the rest of the NED community who are here. Thank you to the broader democracy community who are here. I see some of you out there. Thank you to the Ambassador of Canada for hosting this wonderful evening. Thank you, Sydney, for coming and for gracing us with your presence. But let me begin on a more difficult note, because as we are all sitting here, a very brutal war is unfolding in Ukraine. The brutality is not only evident on the battlefield. So Russian soldiers have rounded up civilians, beaten them, sent them to concentration camps, and deported them to Russia. When the Ukrainians liberate their territory, they find mass graves, makeshift prisons, and torture chambers. And this violence illustrates a central fact about the war, namely that the Putin regime is fighting it not only to occupy parts of Ukraine and not only to destroy Ukraine as a nation, but also to show the outside world that it doesn't care about human rights, about the laws of war, about respect for borders, or about 70 years of European and UN diplomacy, and it will no longer pretend to do so. At the same time, on the other side of the world, Iranian police and security services are carrying out acts of brutality too. So young women and even schoolgirls have marched and demonstrated for the right to be unveiled, for the right to travel and work freely, for the right to make their own decisions about their own lives. And their demands and the demands of others, of the factory workers and others who are on strike in sympathy, have also been met with repression, with arrests, and with violence. One young Iranian girl was murdered for singing a resistance song. Russians have also forbidden Ukrainians from singing Ukrainian songs. So different regimes, same tactics. Meanwhile, just a few weeks ago, the Chinese Communist Party held a Congress that consolidated the rule of Xi Jinping, who is now the de facto dictator of the largest country in the world. He's come to enjoy this position by staging a so-called war on corruption, that turned into a mass purge, by inventing new surveillance tactics that control and monitor the movements and the internet activity and the purchases of ordinary people, by destroying a powerful democracy movement in Hong Kong, and by crushing civil society all over the rest of the country. This week, his police are systematically tracking down and arresting people who have dared to speak out, not just against the draconian COVID restrictions, but the evolution of China into not just a one-party, but a one-man regime. Usually, we think of these stories, Russia, Iran, and China, as belonging to different geographic areas, different parts of the world, and we assume that they have a little relationship to one another. But the fact that they are all unfolding at the moment is not a coincidence, because they are linked. Let me use the time that I have with you this evening to explain how and why. All of us have in our minds a kind of cartoon image of what an autocratic state looks like. So there's a bad man at the top, and he controls the police, and the police threaten people with violence. There are some evil collaborators and maybe some brave dissidents. But in the 21st century, that cartoon bears little resemblance to reality. Because nowadays, autocracies are run not just by one bad guy, but by sophisticated networks composed of kleptocratic financial structures, security services, meaning police, military, paramilitary groups, surveillance, and professional propagandists. And the members of these networks are connected not only within a given country, but among many countries. So the corrupt, state-controlled companies in one dictatorship do business very easily with the corrupt, state-controlled companies in another. So the police in one country can arm and equip and train the police in another. The propagandists share resources. The troll farms that promote one dictator's propaganda can easily be used to promote the propaganda of another. And they also share themes. So they kind of pound home the same messages about the weakness of democracy and the evil of America, of the West, of the democratic world. This is not to say that there is some super secret room where bad guys meet, as in a James Bond movie. Nor does the new autocratic alliance have a unifying ideology. So among modern autocrats are people who call themselves communists, nationalists, and theocrats. Putinism, Chavismo, North Korean Juche, the Islamic Republic, and Chinese communism all have different historical roots, different aesthetics, different language. And no one country leads this group either. Washington likes to talk a lot about Chinese influence. But what really bonds the members of this club is a common desire to preserve and enhance their own power and their personal power and wealth. So unlike military or political alliances from other times and places, the members of this group don't operate as a bloc, but rather like an agglomeration of companies. So as you heard from the lecture title, you can call it Autocracy Incorporated or Autocracy Inc. And their links are cemented not by ideals, but by deals. So deals designed to take the edge off Western sanctions or economic boycotts, or to make them personally rich. And that's why they can operate so easily across ideological, geographical, and historical lines. How does this work? Here's an example. Belarus, a country that has lately been in the news. So in theory, Belarus is an international pariah. Many Belarusian goods can't be sold in the US or Europe. Belarus's brutality has been criticized by many international institutions. When Belarus kidnapped one of its citizens by forcing a commercial airliner to land in the country, the Belarus national airline was banned across Europe. And yet, in practice, Belarus is not so isolated. Belarus remains the site of one of China's largest overseas development projects. Iran has expanded its relationship with Belarus over the last couple of years. Cuban officials have expressed their solidarity with Belarus and with Lukashenko, its leader at the UN. And of course, Russia offers markets, cross-border investments, support. In return, Belarus has allowed Russia to base troops and weapons on its territory. And Belarus has helped Russia avoid its own sanctions. In theory, Venezuela is also an international pariah. So since 2008, the US and Canada and the EU and many of Venezuela's South American neighbors have increased sanctions on that country as well. And yet, at the same time, despite this isolation, Maduro's regime receives loans as well as oil investment from Russia. Turkey facilitates the illicit Venezuelan gold trade. Cuba has long provided security advisors and security technology to the country's rulers. The Venezuelans use apps and online surveillance technology that comes from China as well. Meanwhile, the international narcotics trade keeps individual members of the regime well supplied with designer shoes. Leopoldo Lopez, one-time mayor of Caracas, who's now living in Spain, observes that although Maduro's opponents have received some foreign assistance and much fuss is made about this supposed foreign influence in Venezuela, it's actually nothing comparable with what Maduro has received. So millions and millions of dollars flow from the autocratic world into Venezuela every year. Like the Belarusian opposition, the Venezuelan opposition has charismatic leaders and dedicated grassroots activists, many of whom have in the past persuaded millions of people to go into the streets and protest. They've organized sit-ins, they've organized independent media, they do charity projects. They're projects that are designed to link different parts of Venezuelan society together. They are well connected, they're thoughtful, they have ideas about how the country should be different. And if their only enemy were the corrupt and bankrupt Venezuelan regime, they might win. But in fact, Lopez and his fellow dissidents are fighting multiple autocrats in multiple countries. And so, like so many people who've been propelled into politics by the experience of injustice, like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in Belarus, like the leaders of the extraordinary Hong Kong protest movement, like the young women in Iran, like the Cubans who now demonstrate much more frequently than we even know, like Zimbabweans and Burmese who are pushing for democracy and freedom in their countries, the Venezuelans are fighting against people who control state companies, who can make investments worth billions of dollars for purely political reasons. They're fighting against people who can buy sophisticated surveillance technology from China or bots from St. Petersburg. And above all, they're fighting against people who have inured themselves to the feelings and opinions of their own countrymen, as well as the feelings and opinions of everybody else. Because Autocracy Inc. gives not only money and security to its members, but also something less tangible and yet just as important, which is impunity. So it's important to remember how recent this is. So once upon a time, the leaders of the Soviet Union, the most powerful autocracy in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, they cared deeply about how they were perceived by the rest of the world. And they vigorously promoted the superiority of their political system. They objected when it was criticized. They even pounded their shoes on the table at the United Nations. Today, the most brutal members of Autocracy Inc. don't care if their countries are criticized or by whom. The leaders of Burma or Zimbabwe don't really stand for anything beyond self-enrichment and their desire to remain in power, and so they can't be embarrassed. The leaders of Iran confidently discount the views of Western infidels. The leaders of Cuba and Venezuela dismiss the statements of foreigners on the grounds that these are just imperialists. The leaders of China and Russia have spent a decade disputing the human rights language that was long used by international institutions, successfully convincing many people around the world either that these so-called Western concepts don't apply to them, or that they personally represent some other form of democracy, differently defined, that's somehow better and different from the foreign form. So impervious to international criticism, modern autocrats feel no shame about the use of open brutality. The Russian troops are not hiding the torture chambers that they've built. They're not concealing the mass graves that they've filled with people. The Burmese junta is unashamed to murder hundreds of protesters, including young teenagers on the streets of Rangoon. The Chinese government boasts about its destruction of the popular democracy movement in Hong Kong. At its extremes, this kind of contempt can devolve into what the international democracy activist Sergio Popovich has called the Maduro model of governance, after the leader of Venezuela. And autocrats who adopt it are willing to see their country enter the category of failed states. They will accept economic collapse, isolation, and mass poverty, just as Venezuela has, if that's what it takes to stay in power. So Assad has applied the Maduro model in Syria. It's what Lukashenko is clearly preparing in Belarus. It seemed to be what the Taliban leadership had in mind when they occupied Kabul, and it seems to be what Putin is satisfied with in Russia. So their goal is not to create prosperity. It's not to build the wealth of the country. None of the things that we consider to be central to politics in our minds. Their goal is to enrich themselves and their families and to stay in power. Now here is where the story comes a little bit closer to home. For how is it that modern autocrats have achieved such impunity? Well, part of the answer is that it's because they've persuaded so many people in the rest of the world to go along with them. Take one of the stranger examples. This is a story told to me by the Uyghurs of Istanbul. I met several of them last year, partly thanks to introductions arranged by people in this room. They were ordinary people. They were students or office workers, but a few of them were extraordinary in one sense. While outside their country, all of them had learned that their parents had been arrested. They discovered that their siblings had suddenly stopped answering telephone calls, or they'd been told or sent pictures of their family homes, which were suddenly deserted and empty. While in Turkey, I met a Uyghur woman whose husband had disappeared along with several of her children. Later on, accidentally, she saw a photograph of her children in a Chinese orphanage being featured on social media. In another era, these victims of disappearances and mass arrests would have plenty of official sympathy in Turkey, which is a nation that is singularly linked to the Uyghur community by ties of religion, language, and ethnicity. In 2009, even before the concentration camps were opened in Xinjiang, President Erdogan, who was then the Turkish prime minister, called the Chinese repression of the Uyghurs a genocide. In 2012, he brought business with him to Xinjiang, and he promised to invest in Uyghur businesses there. He created the idea that there would be a special relationship between Turkey and the people of Xinjiang. Yet since then, Erdogan himself has turned against the rule of law, against independent media, and against independent courts at home. And as he has become hostile, sometimes openly hostile, even to former European and NATO allies, as he's arrested and jailed his own dissidents, Erdogan's interest in Chinese friendship and investment and technology has increased, along with his willingness to echo Chinese propaganda. So on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, his party's flagship newspaper in Turkey published a long, solemn article. It was, in fact, sponsored content beneath the headline, "The Chinese Communist Party's 100 Years of Glorious History and the Secrets to Its Success," in case anybody was wondering if it was nuanced. Alongside these changes, government policy towards the Uyghurs has shifted too. So in recent years, some of you know that the Turkish government has surveilled and detained Uyghurs on bogus terrorism charges. They've deported some of them, including 4 who were sent to Tajikistan and then immediately turned over to China in 2019. In Istanbul, I met one Uyghur activist. He was anonymous, preferred to remain anonymous, who'd spent time in a Turkish detention center along with some of his family, following what he said were bogus charges of terrorism. And of course, appeals to the Turks for help finding their relatives receive no response. And for the moment, the Uyghurs in Turkey are still protected by what remains of democracy there. So the opposition parties, some of the media, public opinion, a government that faces democratic elections, even skewed ones, must still take these things into account. But in countries where opposition, media, and public opinion matter less, the balance is different. And you can see this even in Muslim countries, which might be expected to object to the oppression of other Muslims. So the former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan once stated openly that we accept the Chinese version of the Chinese-Uyghur dispute. The Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Egyptians have all arrested, detained, and deported Uyghurs without much discussion. Not coincidentally, all of these countries seek good economic relations with China, and they've all purchased Chinese surveillance technology too. And indeed, there's a broader pattern here, because for autocrats and would-be autocrats around the world, the Chinese, together with the Russians and the rest of the autocratic world, do offer a package that looks something like this. Agree to follow our lead on our interpretation of Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs, on human rights more broadly, on Ukraine. buy Chinese surveillance equipment, accept massive Chinese investment, perhaps some Russian mercenaries. Then sit back and relax, knowing that however bad your image becomes in the eyes of the international human rights community, however much your fellow countrymen suffer or become poorer, you and your friends will remain in power. And how different are we? We Americans, we Europeans, we Canadians. Let me go back in time for a moment and tell you that in the spring of 2015, I helped to publish a report on the Russian use of disinformation in Central and Eastern Europe. And together with a colleague, we took it around Washington, we went to Capitol Hill, we went to the State Department, to anyone who would listen. And the response was kind of polite interest. You know, we're very sorry that Slovenia is having these problems, but of course, nothing like that can happen here in America. A few months later, of course, it did. Russian trolls operating from St. Petersburg sought to shift the outcome of an American election, much in the same way they'd done in Central Europe, using fake Facebook pages and fake Twitter accounts, attempting to infiltrate groups like the NRA, sharing hacked material from the Democratic National Committee with WikiLeaks, and then helping to turn that into dozens of conspiracy theories. Famously, instead of rejecting this interference, instead of pointing out that this was undemocratic or maybe illegal, the Trump campaign welcomed it. "If it's what you say, I love it," said Donald Trump Jr. to an intermediary whom he believed had access to damaging information about Hillary Clinton, hacked by Moscow. But I'm not quoting him in a spirit of partisanship, because that response was consistent not just with his family's behavior, but with his industry's behavior over the previous 2 decades. In 2008, Trump's son told a business conference that, quote, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets." Well, that statement could have been made at that time by dozens of other real estate investors in New York, in Miami, in London, where anonymous owners of shell companies were being allowed to buy apartments that could be used like Swiss bank accounts as places to hide money. Thousands of such purchases enriched Americans and Europeans, as well as their clients, the children of Chinese oligarchs or African oil magnates. All of them participated in the same shadow world of secretive finance, which is the normal milieu of Autocracy Inc. Nor did you have to be in real estate to be in that part of the world, because in truth, the list of major American and European corporations and businessmen caught entangled webs of personal, financial, and business links to China and Russia and other autocracies is very long. We all now know Russian money can buy the services of former German chancellors. It can buy dinners with the British Prime Minister. We know that American or British or Dutch or Irish banks and law firms can help foreign autocrats as well as domestic business tycoons to steal and then launder and hide their money inside the international financial system too. A year ago, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists published excerpts from the Pandora Papers. This was a large cache of documents detailing the operations of tax havens and the people who keep money in them. What really caught my eye in that particular leak was that the records made clear how much clandestine financial traffic goes through Delaware, Nevada, South Dakota, and Wyoming. So not Caribbean islands, not obscure foreign places. These are nice, normal American states full of nice, normal Americans, all of whom were helping nameless investors hide their money from the tax authorities in their respective countries. So once you understand the scope and the range of this world of secret financial operations, then it becomes easier to understand why the old tools of diplomacy that we once used to push back against autocratic political systems have become so weak. Sanctions, for example. While it's true that the application of personal sanctions to corrupt Russian officials might make it hard for some of them to visit their homes in the south of France, they haven't persuaded Putin to stop invading other countries or poisoning his own dissidents. Neither have decades of US sanctions changed the behavior of the Iranian regime or the Venezuelan regime, despite their indisputable economic impact. In part, this is because the autocracies do help one another get around them. So the recent discovery, as Damon mentioned earlier, that Iranian drones sold to Moscow actually contained components manufactured in the West is a case in point. But this is also because the sanctions rules have loopholes that can be easily got around with fake passports or by transferring money between people, to children, to cousins. And invariably, accountants, lawyers, and traders from the democratic world can be found who are perfectly willing to help them do it. They get away with it, in other words, because we help them. And yet, there's nothing natural or organic about any of these systems. You know, these arrangements by which autocrats hide their money, the arrangements that keep them feeling like they can't lose power. Nor is there anything inevitable about the decline of the democratic world or the victory of autocracy. Because what happens tomorrow is determined not by mystical laws of history or rules about declines and fall, but by what actions we take today. And by the same token, once we understand that we helped to build the kleptocratic structures in which Autocracy Inc. thrives, then we might begin to realize that we can also help take them apart. Let me spend the final part of my lecture convincing you that that is possible, that there are concrete steps that we can take, and that there are ways of thinking about this, there are ways of doing this that are not just possible, but doable. The first and most obvious thing to state is that there is no natural liberal world order, and there are no rules unless someone enforces them. So all of the huffing and puffing about the rules and the order that's being broken, it's pointless, it's meaningless. You know, unless democracies defend themselves together, then the forces of autocracy will always try to undermine them. And I'm using the word forces in the plural deliberately, because although I understand that for a lot of reasons, many American politicians would prefer to focus on the long-term competition with China. As long as Russia is ruled by Putin, then Russia is at war with us too. So are Belarus, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, and potentially many others. Hungary and Turkey, members of the NATO alliance, at times will support Autocracy Inc. as well. We might not want to compete with any of them. You know, we might not even care very much about them, but they care about us. So their elites understand that our language of democracy, our rules about anti-corruption, our talk of justice is dangerous to their forms of autocratic power, and they know that that language originates in the democratic world, which is our world, and they will therefore do what they can to undermine us, whether we want that to happen or not. First thing to say about this fight is that it is not theoretical. So it requires armies and strategies and weapons and long-term plans. It requires much closer allied cooperation, not only in Europe, but in the Pacific and Africa and Latin America. You know, NATO can no longer operate as it did for the last 30 years, as if it might someday be required to defend itself. It needs to start operating as it did during the Cold War, on the assumption that an invasion could happen at any time. Germany's decision to raise defense spending is a good start, so are increasing defense budgets in other European countries. But I do hope that in the next few years, people become more creative. You know, deeper military and intelligence coordination might require new strategic institutions, maybe a voluntary European Legion connected to the European Union, maybe a Baltic alliance that includes Sweden and Finland, maybe some different thinking about where and how we invest in European and Pacific defense. Second principle to remember is this one. If we don't have any means to deliver our messages to the autocratic world, then no one will hear them. People don't automatically know what we're talking about when we speak about democracy. They don't automatically listen to it. So much as we assembled the Department of Homeland Security out of disparate agencies after 9/11, it would make sense now to pull together the disparate parts of the US government that think about communication, not to do propaganda, but to reach more people around the world with better information and to stop autocracies from distorting that knowledge. Frankly, independent media is failing all over the world. Business models don't support it anymore. The social media platforms that have replaced it are very easily undermined. we need some bigger and bolder and different ways to compete. Maybe we need Russian language television stations that can compete with Putin's propaganda, not just in Russia, but all over the Russian-speaking world. Why can't we produce more programming in Mandarin or in Uyghur? Our foreign language broadcasters, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, they need not only money for programming, but also for major investments in research. Actually, we know very little about Russian audiences, what they read, what might be eager to learn. And suddenly we've discovered that really it would be useful if we could talk to them. Funding for education and culture needs rethinking as well. Shouldn't there be a Russian language university in Vilnius or Warsaw to house all of the intellectuals and thinkers who've just left Moscow and Minsk? Don't we need to spend more on education in Arabic and Hindi and Persian? So much of what passes for cultural diplomacy now runs kind of on autopilot. Maybe it's time to recast programs for a different era, one in which, although the world is more knowable than ever before, dictatorships go to ever greater lengths to hide that knowledge from their citizens. Next, maybe it's time that we also acknowledged that trading with autocrats promotes autocracy and not democracy. That doesn't mean that global trade networks need to shut down, just that we shouldn't be under any illusion about how they really work and who they enrich, and monitor them accordingly. So I should note that Congress has made some progress in recent months in the fight against global kleptocracy, and also that the Biden administration does talk about putting the fight against corruption at the heart of its strategy. But we can go further, starting with the principle that there is no reason for any company, property, or trust ever to be held anonymously. So every US state, every democratic country could immediately make all ownership transparent. Tax havens could be illegal. The only people who need to keep their houses, businesses, and incomes secret are, after all, crooks and tax cheats. So we need to enforce money laundering laws, stop selling security and surveillance technology to autocracies, and divest from the most vicious regimes altogether. And we here, of course, means the US and Europe, as well as partners, again, in Asia, Latin America, and around the world, and that will require a lot of vigorous diplomacy. Next, we need a dramatic and profound shift in our energy consumption, and not only because of climate change. So the billions of dollars that we send every year to Russia and Iran and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia have promoted some of the most aggressive and corrupt dictators in the world. Because every dollar spent on Russian oil helps fund the artillery that fires on Ukrainian civilians, the transition from oil and gas to other energy sources needs to happen with far greater speed and decisiveness. So for those of you in this room who work professionally on democracy promotion or who have an interest in international security, I would note that there's an opportunity here to build a coalition. So the people who care about climate change and the people who care about defeating autocracy are not always on the same side or in the same rooms or working together. But they should be. Why not? They should be talking about the same projects, lobbying for the same legislation all over the democratic world. And this leads me to my next point, which is that we need more coalitions, different coalitions in many other spheres too. So after all, if the leaders of the autocratic world are able to work together, to cooperate with one another, if they can help one another suppress internal opposition, teach one another how to use surveillance technology, then why can't the democratic world also work together to push back against them? And here, I mean something very specific, not just democratic governments, but also the democratic opposition in Russia, in Hong Kong, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Cuba, in Zimbabwe, and so many other states, too numerous here to list. Because for too long, we've seen each one of these struggles as unique, which of course in some ways they are, but they're also connected, perhaps more deeply than ever before, by the fact that they faced a common enemy. So not just Putin, not just Xi, but not just Maduro, but Autocracy Inc. How could this work? Well, many different groups in different places are very good at exposing theft in high places in their own countries. What if their projects could be internationalized with work shared and amplified in many countries? What if they came up with joint lists of laws to pass and rules to change? What if they lobbied for those things together? There are also mutual opportunities for support around training, around advocacy for political prisoners, around aid for exiles. Some of this is beginning to happen thanks to the National Endowment's World Movement for Democracy, to the recently launched World Liberty Congress, to groups like the Oslo Freedom Forum and others. But they could be taken more seriously, sponsored more systematically, and of course, listened to more carefully. Finally, in the spirit of Seymour Martin Lipset, let me end by arguing that all of us really do need to take democracy more seriously, to teach it, to debate it, to improve it, and defend it. So maybe there is no natural liberal world order, but there are liberal societies, there are open and free countries that offer a better chance for people to live useful lives than closed dictatorships do. And they are hardly perfect. Our own has deep flaws and profound divisions and terrible historical scars. But that's all the more reason to protect and defend them, because actually not very many of them have existed across human history. Many have existed for a short time and then failed, and they can be destroyed not only from the outside, but from the inside too. If the 20th century was the story of a slow, uneven struggle, ending with the victory of liberal democracy over other ideologies, communism, fascism, the 21st century is so far a story of the reverse. The Stanford scholar Larry Diamond calls this an era of democratic regression, and every survey that you can think of demonstrates that this conclusion is true, not only in the autocratic world, but in the world of established democracies too, where democratic decline is also a fact. But there's also another way to look at it. Perhaps the autocrats are working together because they no longer have confidence in their ability to fight their own democracy movements alone. Perhaps they're becoming less tolerant because they realize that their opponents have better arguments, that people listen to them, and that the desire for political freedom, which we have seen so clearly in China, in Iran, in Ukraine, will never go away. Perhaps the confrontations between autocrats and their populations are growing harsher precisely because democratic movements are becoming more articulate and better organized. I started tonight by talking about the Russians. Now let me end by talking about the Ukrainians, because I think there's something that we can all learn from the Ukrainians. For decades now in America, we've been fighting a kind of culture war between liberal values on the one hand, supposedly on that side, and kind of muscular forms of patriotism on the other. Ukrainians are showing us that it's possible to have both. As soon as the attacks began, they overcame their many political divisions, which are no less bitter than ours, and they picked up weapons to fight. They demonstrated that it is possible to be a patriot and a believer in an open society, that a democracy can be stronger and fiercer than its opponents. So precisely because there is no liberal world order, there are no norms and no rules that are automatic, we also find that we might have to fight for our open societies to continue to exist as well. It's a genuine honor to be here in a room with so many people from the National Endowment, from the broader democracy community. All of you are the true philosophical heirs of Seymour Martin Lipset. You are all the people who will be leading this fight in years to come. I look forward to seeing what you're going to do, and thank you very much.